What's up guys, Agent here, and this is going to be my review of the Endwalker expansion for Final Fantasy XIV. I finally got around to finishing up the MSQ this past weekend, and boy, I'll just say that I am glad that I picked up Final Fantasy XIV when I did. The expansion itself is nothing short of a masterpiece. There are some weaknesses, I think, in the expansion, but those generally don't take away from my overall enjoyment of the expansion thus far. So before we start going into things, this is the obligatory spoilers warning. So if you have not yet started or completed Endwalker or any of the previous expansions, I would highly recommend that you go and start playing the game and get going through the MSQ, because I will be touching upon spoilers throughout this video, not just for Endwalker, but possibly for prior expansions as well. Talking about some details from prior expansions because context might be needed for some of the points that I'll be discussing. So this is your chance now to click away to avoid any spoilers. But otherwise, if you're fine with being spoiled, you can continue to watch. This video will be broken up into three main sections here, the three sections that I believe are worth talking about. The first one is going to be a pretty chunky part of this video. It's going to be covering the story, basically the MSQ story, how it all ties in together, the narrative, things like that. The second part is going to be a little bit smaller, but no less important. It's going to be the gameplay. Like any other MMOs, Final Fantasy did introduce quite a few gameplay changes, combat changes, rebalances, things like that in Endwalker. So I'll be discussing how the game feels compared to Shadowbringers, as well as comparing it to the most recent MMO that I've played, ESO. And finally, this last section, I feel like this deserves its own section here just because of how fantastic it is. And it's basically audio-visual. I think that Endwalker in particular the audio-visual part of Endwalker does deserve its own sort of section here, and other sort of miscellaneous stuff will also be covered in that final section as well. So, the story of Endwalker. This expansion was designed to wrap up the Zodiark/Hydaelyn arc of the Final Fantasy XIV story, and this arc has been in motion since the very first launch of 1.0. So this was back before A Realm Reborn and Final Fantasy XIV as we know it currently was released. So all the way through A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers, Endwalker is supposed to tie up all those loose ends and finish that story arc that we have been dealing with for the past, at this point, I think it's been almost 10 years. And it has done quite the job of wrapping up all the loose ends here. At the very end of the MSQ, I was sort of musing to myself that there really didn't leave many loose ends out there. And what loose ends I can think of that they did leave out from previous expansions might just be there because they want sort of an in for future expansions. Yoshi P has already said that they have the next 10 years planned out. I think that might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration, but based on the detail that the story writers have put into the MSQ for Endwalker, Shadowbringers, and all the other expansions, I honestly wouldn't be surprised if they did plan that far out in advance this next story arc. So the story itself subverted a lot of expectations. We kind of had an idea of what we were getting ourselves into between all the discussions on the live letter from FanFest, from all the trailers that we've seen, but it defied my personal expectations. So at the end of Shadowbringers at 5.55 and 5.58, we were introduced to the towers, and we learn in Endwalker really early on that these towers are sucking the aether out of the land itself. To what purpose, we aren't made aware of until about a third of the way into the storyline itself. So going into the story, I thought, oh, this would be a relatively straightforward MSQ, at least for the maybe first half, first 2/3 of the fight of the MSQ. We take down all the towers, the dungeons will be the towers, and we take down Fandaniel and Xenos, and then we eventually get to the moon, fight off Zodiark, and hurrah, we save the day. That ended up not being the case at all. We started off investigating a tower in Thavnair, and eventually we moved on to Garlemald. We already knew we were going to Garlemald from the trailers and the live letters from FanFest. But the whole Garlemald story itself was it was poignant. It definitely sort of shone a different light on the plight of Garlemald ever since the Civil War started back in Stormblood. I should say towards the end of Stormblood, after the post-Stormblood quest, when Xenos finally gets his body back and kills the Emperor, Emperor Varus. That entire Garlemald storyline, part of it felt a little bit contrived. It definitely felt like the devs had the story writers had a sort of vision for Garlemald, and you can rightly see it so. It does play into the stereotypical conquering nation JRPG tropes for some of the characters, but it also humanized a lot of the Garleans and in some degree. And the quest that they brought you on, the insight that you get into the plight of the Garleans following the Civil War, after the start of the final days that were orchestrated by Fandaniel, the what's the word I'm looking for? Uh, the indifference of Xenos towards actually ruling the Garlean Empire. All that is brought to light, and you can see how it has made the people suffer, and it definitely humanizes some of them. At the same time, though, there are those hardcore Garleans. Remember that the Garlean Empire was sort of designed around the Roman Empire, so there are Garleans out there that have a streak of nationalism, not unlike what we're seeing today in real life. And so, on the one hand, you sort of pity some of the Garleans, particularly the civilians that had no fight, no say, no nothing really in this fight, this civil war. But at the same time, you also feel sort of you get what you deserve, you sow the seeds of your own destruction sort of mindset as well when you speak to some of those more hardline, pure-blooded Garleans as well. And this all culminated in the final assault on the huge tower called Tower of Babel in Garlean, in Garlemald, the capital of the Garlean Empire. And from there, we confront Fandaniel and Xenos, and much sooner than I anticipated, we were on the moon. The moon is actually the fourth zone that you enter, that you sort of get into. And if we're going by zone completion, this is actually the second zone that you fully complete. And by completion, I mean you're able to fly in the zone. So we got to the moon fairly early on, much sooner than I was anticipating. I was expecting the moon to be the fifth or even the sixth zone. But no, this was the level 84 zone, so this is relatively early on in the game. And we ended up fighting Zodiark. Within the first third of the game, we fight Zodiark, and we kill him. Well, we don't kill him, then Daniel does. And so, all of a sudden, this plot line that we thought we knew, that we thought was going to happen, ended prematurely. And from there, we had no idea. I had no idea what sort of journey we were going to go down on this MSQ. None at all. After Zodiac died, we are given a vision of some mysterious being influencing Aetheris, Hydaelyn, our star. Excuse me. But we don't know who it is. We suspect it's the final days. We're not 100% sure. This is uncharted territory. With Zodiac dead, we don't know what's going on, and Hydaelyn herself has not talked to us about the repercussions of what happens when Zodiac no longer exists. But from the cutscene immediately following our fight with Zodiac, we can tell that it was not good. That Zodiac was, in fact, protecting the planet from some outside force that is now able to influence Aetheris. And it is not soon after that we see what the influence is. The final days are brought down first upon Thavnair, and we are now experiencing what the Amrotines, what the ancients, what the Ascians faced thousands of years prior. And from there, it is basically all sorts of lore dump. There's so much lore that happens in this expansion, and a huge chunk of it starts after we finish off Zodiark. we meet the Heidelin sort of backup plan. She has foreseen she has foreseen this event or anticipated this event and has a backup plan. We are to escape Aetheris and find a new star to settle on. But obviously, we as the Scions think it is worthwhile to fight for our star. So from 84 all the way through to about 80 level 86, it's just a huge lore dump. And this is the part where we really had no idea what was happening. We had no idea where we were going. We had no idea where the story was going. Because even though we were getting some interesting lore and some interesting information, none of it seemed to be working towards solving the final days, preventing the final days, figuring out what exactly is happening during the final days, what causes it, how we can stop it, all that stuff. And it wasn't until a chance remembrance, a bit of a memory sequence that we remembered that Hydaelyn had given us a flower and had told of us its name, Elpis. And with that name, we went back to the sole unsundered Ascian left to us that we can communicate with, Elidibus, still trapped in the Crystal Tower on the first. So that was a bit of a welcome surprise that we are calling upon Elidibus to help us. That part of the story to me was definitely, it was gratifying to see that Elidibus's story had come full circle, that he had found some measure of closure and peace with helping us reach into the distant past. That's right. Elidibus uses the Crystal Tower to send us back to the time of the Unsundered, back to the time of the Ancients, where we are delivered to Elpis, the research facility manned by the Ancients. And who do we meet there? But none other than our old new friend, Hythlodaeus, and his best friend, Emet-Selch. And boy, oh boy, Emet-Selch. We knew he was going to be in the story. He was the narrator for the gameplay trailer, for the launch trailer. We knew he was going to be here, and it was a blast. That entire section, that entire quest line in Elpis was so very enjoyable because of the NPCs. That entire sequence in Elpis, again, was a lot of lore, a lot of background information, sort of how did the final days happen? What were the events that caused it? We learned in that storyline in Elpis what exactly caused the final days. We learn so much about the ancients. We meet Vina, the heart of Hydaelyn, the woman who would eventually become the mother, well, not the mother crystal, but the goddess of light herself. And we go on a journey and we discover what exactly happened, what caused the final days in our journey in Elpis. And we almost lost it too. We almost forgot what caused the final days, but through the ingenious of Hythlodaeus and Emet-Selch, we managed to escape with our memory and use that to help plan our assault in the present day against the final days. And wouldn't you happen to know it? Vina also escaped memory manipulation as well. And so it all starts to come together. Why Hydaelyn knows so much. Why Hydaelyn anticipated what would happen. Because she herself knows what caused the final days. And we also gain insight as to why she did nothing about it as well. That entire Elpis storyline is just so fantastic. I really wish that it was a longer, more substantial part of the story, or that we are able to go back and explore that part of Aetheris' history more. I loved how they characterized Hythlodaeus. I love that they maintained Emet-Selch's sort of character as this sort of aloof, quasi-arrogant, but ultimately a very kind-hearted individual. I love the characterization of Vina and how you can see in her behavior, why she became the heart of Hydaelyn and why Hydaelyn acts the way she does. There's just so much in Elpis, in that entire storyline, as brief as it was, that covered so much and revealed so much lore. For me, I like to get into the lore of the games that I play, that I get invested in, and that was just an absolute treat. From there, now that we know what caused the final days, we are able to formulate, to some extent, a plan of attack. And so the last 88 through 90 MSQ is basically our attempts of enacting our plan. But the first thing that we need is we need to get clarity from Hydaelyn. And so, with the help of old Charlian, Borshino, that asshole who disowned his own children, we learn about his motivations. We learn why Charlian did what they did. We learned why the Forum ruled the way they did. And it was all basically because they were all privy to Hydaelyn's plan of evacuating Aetheris, of using the moon to travel to a new star. And Fortuno, in his love for his children, didn't want that plan to come to ruination. He didn't want that plan to fail. He wanted to drag Alice and Alphino by their ears if he had to, onto this ship that will deliver them from what he sees as inevitable death of the star from the final days itself. But as JRPGs are wont to do, Borshino has a change of heart after he sees the growth of his children and what the scions are capable of performing, and allows us to use the Charlian method of communing with Hydaelyn in the Ethereal Sea. And then when we finally meet with Hydaelyn, again, as JRPGs are wont to do, we must prove our worth by fighting her. And I will have to say, I was not anticipating fighting Hydaelyn as the level 89 trial boss. Again, I wasn't sure who to expect after we killed Zodiark on the moon so early in the MSQ. But it makes sense now that we would have to fight off Hydaelyn. When, after the trial, you kind of think about what you learned in Elpis, what you learned about Vina and her motivations, and how Hydaelyn, Vina as a heart of Hydaelyn, why Hydaelyn would inherit those sort of motivations as well. And all sorts to click after that trial. Hydaelyn gives herself up. She knew that this final trial, this final fight, would be her final act as Hydaelyn the Primal. Hydaelyn the goddess, Hydaelyn the protector of Aetheris. She entrusts Aetheris' future to us, stating that we are able to stop Meteion because of the final days. We're able to journey to where she has made her nest and prevent her from enacting calamity on Aetheris. And so, that is what we did. Borshino, now essentially being a Scion ally, permits us to use their vessel, combined with the power of the Mother Crystal, to journey out to the very far reaches of the universe, where Meteion, because of the final days, has made her nest. And by God, that final zone was poetic. It was fantastically written all the way through. Essentially, the Scions themselves, the way that they were set up in each of those different zones, in each of those different sort of stories of each of those civilizations that Meteion had discovered on her journey into the stars, searching for the meaning of life, why people live. It was beautiful, and it was poignant, and it was very much on point to everything, essentially. And that final sequence, the final quest, final cutscene leading up to the final quest, leading up to the final level 90 dungeon and the final fight against Meteion, the end singer, was beautiful. It brought tears to my eyes. This entire expansion, there were definitely multiple times in the expansion where tears were cried, emotional tears, not tears of sadness, or possibly tears of sadness. But it was beautiful, and of course, in his typical fashion, Emmett Selk and Hythlodaeus appear in our moment of need to deliver us what we need to finally fight off Meteion and kill her, finish her off, or at the very least give us the tools to shut her down. Between us and the Scions, however, there was one final adversary turned ally Xenos. Now, initially, when we first saw the FanFest and saw the trailers, we thought that Xenos would ultimately be the final level 90 trial boss. But ever since Zodiac was killed back at the level 83 trial, he's sort of just been in the background. He was not really a major player there. And to some extent, I'm a little disappointed. I wish that they fleshed out Xenos a little bit more. That's not to say I am dissatisfied with how they characterized him in this expansion. I feel like this expansion sort of, in a way, we got to understand Xenos and sort of his motivations, and they sort of are a foil almost to Meteion. Whereas Meteion couldn't find an answer like her answer to Hermes' question of what makes life worth living is very different from Xenos's. Xenos lives for the thrill of battle. He lives for the present. He lives for the day. But Meteion believes that there is no point in living. That life just leads to suffering and death, and you know the sweeter release would be just to never exist in the first place. Whereas Xenos believes that existence itself is the meaning of life, and making the most of your existence is what drives him. And that is what drove him to basically come to our aid in the final moments of Endwalker. He comes in as Shinryu, no less, uh, and helps us, gives us the means to defeat Meteion, the Endsinger. And he is actually the final fight of Endwalker. He is a solo duty, the absolute final boss of Endwalker. And that fight itself, there are some controversies behind it, but I think it was an excellent fight. Not just from the gameplay perspective, but from a narrative perspective. Like I mentioned earlier, I think Xenos was designed to be sort of almost a foil, almost to Meteion. Understanding the purpose of living, the purpose of life itself. I think that final fight, that final journey that we went on with Xenos, sort of didn't necessarily fully recover him in my eyes. I still think he was one of the weaker antagonists of Final Fantasy XIV, but it definitely redeemed him a little bit. And I think that they did. I wish they could do more with him, expand him a little bit more. But I think, given what they had, given what was done, I think it was a good send off for Xenos. But yeah, that story absolutely fantastic, a masterpiece of storytelling. The only gripe I kind of had was, of course, the beginning was a little bit slow because, as always, you kind of have to set up the lore, set of the areas that you're visiting, and there's a lot of discovery going on. Some of the quests, Garlemald and Elpis in particular, were a little bit slow, but again, that might be because you're building up the lore, you're building up the story of these new zones. But everything in between, very very fast pace. Once you kind of hit 83, you kind of get fast paced. Very very sort of urgency involved in the MSQ. A little bit of a lull in Elpis, and then again that sense of urgency again once you get towards the tail end of the Elpis storyline there in the 87, 88 sort of quest line there. I should say 86 to 87 quest line there. But yeah, story absolutely fantastic. It is a masterpiece. It's hard to say whether Shadowbringers or Endwalker was better, but they are both fantastic expansions themselves. Now moving on to gameplay. Gameplay is a big part of any video game, right? You don't want to play a game that you don't enjoy playing. They did make quite a few changes in Endwalker compared to Shadowbringers. So they did do what's called a stat crunch. So basically, like most other MMOs, Final Fantasy follows a vertical progression, and so after a certain point, the numbers just get larger and larger, and before they become a little bit unwieldy. The stat crunch was designed to sort of shrink those numbers down to a more manageable level, but still maintaining our overall power, both relative and absolute. And I think they've done a pretty decent job at this. There was some concern that unsynced content, so basically fighting, doing old content at your current level, might be harder, more difficult, slower, whatever. But synced content still feels about the same as it has in the past. And unsynced content, it feels like that balance is still there, where you are still able to steamroll through very old content at max level here. So it does feel like they did a really good job at making sure that stat squish didn't end up in too drastic of a change here. If anything, some of the older synced content feels a little bit faster. There are definitely uh, disadvantages, or I should say, there are some fights that feel slower, particularly towards as you get to the higher and higher level content. Some of those fights, like the Shadowbringer dungeons, for example, the leveling dungeons, the 71, 73, 74, 75, and so on. Some of those feel a little bit slower, but for the most part, combat feels about the same for synced content and unsynced content. It feels right about where the balance was before the stat squish itself. Of course, there were a bunch of, with 10 new levels, we got more abilities to play around with. And while I haven't gotten every single class up to 90, the few classes that I did get up to 90, they definitely feel a lot, they feel fun. Um, not a lot of the classes were changed all too much, at least based on the classes that I play. So all the magic DPS, I managed to get up to 90 there. Black Mage, nothing much really changed with Black Mage. Red Mage, there's a little bit of a change there with some of how you want to deal with your melee combo and things like that. But for the most part, the playstyle is very much the same. Summoner got a whole complete rework, but Summoner now is a lot more fluid and a lot more... I think it's a lot simpler to play now compared to the old Summoner itself. Scholar, I played Scholar. That's one of my main healers. Feels a lot more responsive. They did change the pet AI, so the fairy AI is a lot more responsive. It feels a lot more responsive. And Warrior is just... Warrior is Warrior. It's just Unga Bunga hit things until they die. Warrior itself has kind of become a little bit of a meme, a little bit infamous for bloodwetting in dungeon pulls, where you basically have your own benediction for 8 seconds with bloodwetting. Even with the pre-morph raw intuition, it's still a really chunky heal, and you basically get a benediction every 25 seconds for 6 seconds. So it's a lot of fun, let's just say, with Warrior. So it definitely feels like they have maintain the balance between all the classes. I'm sure with 6.05 coming out soon and 6.1 later on, they're going to do a couple of potency changes. Personally, I think Summoner needs a little bit of a change here, just because you don't really use Ruin 3 too much. I'm anticipating they're probably going to increase the cooldown timer of the Summon Bahamut, Summon Phoenix up to 90 seconds, just to kind of give you a required 30-second Ruin 3 uptime, but they might not. They might just change the potencies and things like that. But gameplay-wise, things feel a lot smoother, and the stat squish itself hasn't really changed too much with combat itself. The dungeons, a lot of fun, definitely a challenge. I went into Endwalker at about 5:30, so that's the highest, about basically the highest eye level that you can have at the end of Shadowbringers, and the dungeons were definitely a bit of a challenge, and part of it might be because we have some returning players who might have a little bit of rust on them from not playing for so long. Some of it might be low DPS, bad healers, etc., undergeared party members, and so on. But it feels like the difficulty level of the dungeons was a little bit more difficult in the beginning, and then got a little bit easier, a little bit more even-footed, I should say, as we got to level 75 and beyond those leveling dungeons. The extreme fights. I have cleared both of the extreme fights, so that is Zodiark and Hydaelyn. And I've also gotten started with the Pandemonium normal raids that are coming out, and of course we're going to go into Pandemonium Savage when that releases next week. I gotta say, the extreme trials were a lot of fun. One thing I really like about Final Fantasy compared to ESO is the fact that mechanics are not something you can just burn through. In Final Fantasy, in ESO, you can just burn through a lot of mechanics because DPS has gotten so high because of the horizontal progression nature of ESO, but you can't quite do that in Final Fantasy because of the vertical progression nature of Final Fantasy. Level 90 fight against Zodiac and Hydaelyn is still relatively difficult. All the groups that I've run into so far, the ones that have cleared, generally we are clearing either right when we get to Enrage up to about 30 to 45 seconds before we would see Enrage. So they're still difficult fights. This is the first patch that I am doing content at while it's current. It was definitely a bit of a change for me. And I just love the mechanics for each of these fights. Without going into too much detail, Zodiac has what I like to call the turntable mechanic, which is a lot of fun it was a lot of fun to figure out in the normal version, and I was like, man, this is going to be insanely fun to figure out on extreme, and it was. It was a lot of fun. It requires a lot of critical thinking, a lot of thinking involved. Island 2. The extreme fight was very different. There's one phase of the normal trial that is very, very different from its counterpart in the extreme trial, where you actually have to line of sight crystals. And I was fortunate enough that I had friends who had already cleared these two fights, and so they were able to give me pointers as to what to do. But I'd imagine if I had went there blind, first day sort of scenario here, it would have taken me at least probably two, maybe even more lockouts to figure out what exactly was happening there with the crystals themselves. So just a lot of interesting mechanics that they've introduced. There is never a dull moment with these mechanics in Final Fantasy, in those endgame fights. The normal Pandemonium trials, I've only done the first two floors. But even there, the mechanics there are, are I don't want to say they're new, because obviously there's only so many ways you can do the same fight. Half room AOE, for example. There's only so many ways you can do that while still being unique. But the way the bosses do these mechanics is interesting. So, for example, the first fight of Pandemonium, the first floor there, you have to watch the boss to know what's half of the room he's going to sweep on, which is not uncommon. But it is a unique. The way that he does it is very unique, and it makes sense for that boss. And of course, there is a new mechanic in that boss itself, which I'm excited to think about how they're going to tweak it for Savage to make it more difficult. Typically, the difference between normal and Savage is you don't get the AoE markers anymore, but also they do tweak the normal mechanics up to the extreme or Savages that are completely different, like in Heidelin, or they get more complex, like with E9S and the Tiles phase. Normal, it's relatively straightforward, but in Savage, it is a dance. It is a dance that you have to know all the steps to if you don't want to end up dying or missing the DPS check for Enrage. I am excited to see what sort of mechanics they're going to show us on Pandemonium Savage. The gameplay is just as fun and exciting as it was back in Shadowbringers when we were progressing through Eden's Promise. I am very very, very much looking forward to Savage and how they're going to continue to expand on the trial fights. Really looking forward to the next, because there's going to be 5 more trials. They're obviously going to do the extreme with the final boss, the last boss, and there's going to be either 3 or 4 more additional trials on top of that. And I am excited to see what they're going to be doing there. It's going to be fantastic, because with the end of Endwalker, they gave us a couple of strings of stories that might be happening in 6.1, 6.2, and so on. But it's basically a completely new story. So we have no idea what direction they're going in. We have no idea who we're going to fight, what's going to be happening here. And I am just excited to see what the team is able to do, not just from a story perspective, but also from a fight mechanic perspective. It is going to be exciting, I think, in endgame PvE in Final Fantasy. At least for me. Maybe for veteran players of Final Fantasy, this is just something that you experience every single patch. But for me, this is the first patch that I am running as current content at current eye level, and it is exciting as hell. I don't remember being this excited for new content ever in ESO. This is a breath of fresh air for me to be this excited about going into Savage, going into hard content in Final Fantasy, being excited to prog this content for weeks and weeks and weeks. So yeah, gameplay, still fantastic as it has always been. And finally, just some sort of miscellaneous stuff, but I do want to give a shout out to the visual audio component of Endwalker. The music is a masterpiece. It is fantastic. Soken and Yoshida P. Soken is the primary composer, and Yoshida P is the director of Final Fantasy XIV. They recommended that you really play the game and listen to the background music, and I am glad that I play with background music because the music itself is so fantastic. It is a masterpiece. And of course, Final Fantasy is known for its story and it's known for its fantastic music, but this is on a whole new level. The only other game I can think of that has a soundtrack that is as good as Final Fantasy XIV would be Genshin Impact's. It is just fantastic. The amount of emotions that Soken is able to do with the musical pieces that he has written, how they fit each cutscene, how they amplify the emotions and sort of direct you towards a story almost. It's just fantastic. And the visuals themselves. Final Fantasy XIV is an old game at this point, so there are obviously going to be limitations on the engine. We're not going to be taking a look at anything groundbreaking in terms of graphics, but the visuals are great. Avner is the equivalent of, I think, southern India, possibly. At the very least, some uh, region of India. And from what I've read on Reddit, it seems like people who are originally from that area think it's pretty accurate. And the environment itself is beautiful. Garlemald, a snowy wasteland. You would think, oh, it's just snow and ice and all that stuff, but there's more to it. The way that the developers created that zone, created Garlemald, in the throes of civil war, you see the ruins, you see the damage that has been done to the capital itself, and you're just like, wow, this is what happened here. You sort of feel the weight of what has happened when you see Garlemald, the capital, for the first time. And that isn't even speaking about, the dungeons, in particular the ITS scope, the level 89 dungeon. That was beautiful. That was absolutely fantastic. The final zone, too. The combination of using silence as a tool, no music, nothing at all, in some of those cutscenes. It is so powerful. It is so powerful. Combining it with the visuals and then the story, everything is just a completely perfectly wrapped package. They really did their work, and I can see why Yoshi P decided to take that extra bit of time to make sure everything was perfect for release. But other miscellaneous stuff that I kind of wanted to cover in Endwalker, um, gearing up. They did make a couple of changes to how you can gear up endgame gearing. That made it a little bit easier. So, for example, the tombstone gear is a little bit cheaper. They added in new instances. That's another thing that I kind of want to touch upon. This expansion was so popular, and uh, I mean, Final Fantasy had already been picking up a lot of steam because of there's been this mass exodus of WoW players that have been coming over to Final Fantasy, sort of pushed along by big WoW streamers, in particular Asmongold, who have been starting to play Final Fantasy and making very good reviews of Final Fantasy. Powermancer is another big WoW streamer that has been on joined the Final Fantasy train, the Final Fantasy hype, so to speak. So the servers are already congested to a certain extent going into Endwalker. But with Endwalker, the servers, I'm surprised that they didn't catch fire. I mean, we always joke about ESO servers catching fire, but it was never because of there's too many players on the server. It was always because of some some bug or something like that. But no, there were 2 3 hour login queues to get into Endwalker in the first week and a half, 2 weeks of Endwalker being released. I remember sitting in a login queue that was about 4,500 people. 4,500 people trying to get into the server to play this expansion. This is insane. And yes, the login queues did suck. They did warn us about them, and we did anticipate them. So I don't begrudge them for that. With the whole COVID thing going on and the complexity of adding in new servers, it is. I fully anticipated it. It was definitely frustrating at times, but I totally understood where they were coming from. But what really shone through during this whole sort of server congestion issue was the fact that they were transparent about everything, about the login queues, about login errors that people were getting. There was an infamous 2002 error that would kick you out from queue, and sometimes it would place you in the backup queue rather than saving your spot. So the development team, Yoshi P in particular, was very transparent. There were at least, off the top of my head, there were at least 3 official posts from Yoshi P addressing the congestion issues, why they were an issue, what steps they were taking to try to mitigate it as best they can, and so on and so forth. And I gotta say, that sort of transparency is a breath of fresh air compared to ESO, where yeah, the devs did communicate, but not quite to the same level of transparency that Yoshi P did. So really, this is just a fantastic expansion. But yeah, that pretty much covers my review of Endwalker. If you haven't picked up Final Fantasy yet, because of the login congestion, because of what's happening right now with server congestion, unfortunately, you can't actually buy Final Fantasy right now. Yoshi P is literally suffering from success because the game is so popular right now that they are stopping new sales, I should say, of Final Fantasy XIV. Unfortunately, you won't be able to play it, and we won't know when they're going to open up sales again. But when they do, I do highly recommend that you guys pick this up. This is a fantastic MMO. If you liked JRPGs, if you loved RPGs, Final Fantasy XIV is fantastic, and Endwalker is the piece de la resistance. My throat is getting sore. I don't think I can actually say it anymore. But it is the crown jewel. It is the pièce de résistance of this entire story arc, and I am excited to see what the team is going to bring in 7.0 for the next journey for our Warrior of Light. Well, that is it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys later.